Hi, this is Dorian Gray, chapter 7. So, in chapter 6, Basil got the news that Dorian was getting engaged. Didn't take it so well at first, but in the end he seemed to be looking after Dorian's best interests. Dorian persuades, in chapter 6, Basil and Lord Henry to come to the theatre with him, to watch the genius of his fiancée, Sybil, performing. So in chapter 7, it's what happens at the theatre. For some reason or other, the house, the theatre, was crowded that night, and the fat Jew manager who met them at the door was beaming from ear to ear with an oily, tremulous smile. He escorted them to their box with a sort of pompous humility. A bit of oxymoron there, those two are usually kind of opposites, but he has them both. Waving his fat, jeweled hands and talking at the top of his voice. And these details say something about him. Of course, he's presented very anti-Semitically. Showy hands, but fat and talkative. Lord Henry, on the other hand, rather liked him. Dorian loathes him. At least he declared he did, and insisted on shaking him by the hand and assuring him that he was proud to meet a man who had discovered a real genius and gone bankrupt over a poet he's lost money putting on Shakespeare more than once. A bit about the atmosphere in the theatre. The heat was terribly oppressive, and the huge sunlight flamed like a monstrous dahlia, a flower, with petals of yellow fire. Some women were laughing in the pit, the orchestra pit. Their voices were horribly shrill and discordant. The sound of the popping of corks came from the bar. What a place to find one's divinity in. Yes, answered Dorian, it was here I found her. And she's divine beyond all living things. When she acts, you will forget everything. These common rough people with their coarse faces and brutal gestures become quite different when she is on the stage. And this is Basil. This marriage is quite right. I did not think so at first, but I admit it now. The gods made Sybil Vane for you. Without her, you would have been incomplete. The show's about to start. Dorian says, but here's the orchestra. It's quite dreadful, but it only lasts for about 5 minutes. Then the curtain rises, and you will see the girl to whom I'm going to give all my life, to whom I have given everything that is good in me. A quarter of an hour afterwards, amidst an extraordinary turmoil of applause, Sybil Vane stepped onto the stage. Yes, she was certainly lovely to look at. One of the loveliest creatures Lord Henry thought that he had ever seen. There was something of the fawn in her shy grace and startled eyes. A faint blush, like the shadow of a rose in a mirror of silver, came to her cheeks as she glanced at the crowded, enthusiastic house. She stepped back a few paces, and her lips seemed to tremble. Basil Hallward leapt to his feet and began to applaud. Motionless, and as one in a dream, sat Dorian Gray gazing at her. Lord Henry peered through his glasses, murmuring, charming, charming. So it's Romeo and Juliet, they're performing. She looks great, the curves of her throat were the curves of a white lily. Her hands seemed to be made of cool ivory. Yet she was curiously listless, almost sleepy, tired. She showed no sign of joy when her eyes rested on Romeo. The first word she had to speak was spoken in a thoroughly artificial manner. So it's a lovely voice, but the tone is wrong, and it makes the passion unreal. Dorian Gray grew pale as he watched her. He was puzzled and anxious. Neither of his friends dared to say anything to him. She seemed to them to be absolutely incompetent. They were horribly disappointed. Yet they felt that the true test of any Juliet is the balcony scene of the second act. They waited for that. If she failed there was nothing in her. She looked charming as she came out into the moonlight. That could not be denied, but the staginess of her acting was unbearable and grew worse as she went on. Her gestures became absurdly artificial. It was not nervousness. Indeed, so far from being nervous, she was absolutely self-contained. It was simply bad art. She was a complete failure. Even the common uneducated audience of the pit and gallery lost their interest in the play. They got restless and began to talk loudly and to whistle. The Jewish manager, who was standing at the back of the dress circle, stamped and swore with rage. The only person unmoved was the girl herself. When the second act was over, there came a storm of hisses, and Lord Henry got up from his chair and put on his coat. "She's quite beautiful, Dorian," he said, "but she can't act. Let us go." "I'm going to see the play through," answered the boy in a hard, bitter voice. "I'm awfully sorry that I've made you waste an evening, Harry. I apologize to you both." "My dear Dorian, I should think Miss Vane was ill." Do you think that says something about Basil? I'm thinking the best of this actress, not that she's terrible, but maybe she's sick. "We will come some other night." "I wish she were ill," he rejoined or replied, "but she seems to me to be simply callous and cold. She has entirely altered. Last night she was a great artist. This evening she's merely a commonplace, ordinary, mediocre, average actress." Lord Henry says, "Well, if she plays Juliet like a wooden doll, what does it matter? I don't suppose you want your wife to act. She's very lovely, and if she knows as little about life as she does about acting, she will be a delightful experience. There are only two kinds of people who are really fascinating: people who know absolutely everything, and people who know absolutely nothing." "Go away, Harry," cried the lad. "I want to be alone. Basil, you must go. Oh, can't you see my heart is breaking?" The hot tears came to his eyes. His lips trembled, and rushing to the back of the box, he leaned up against the wall, hiding his face in his hands. "Let us go, Basil," said Lord Henry, with a strange tenderness in his voice, and the two young men passed out of the room. Now the curtain rises on the third act. Dorian Gray went back to his seat. He looked pale and proud and indifferent. The play dragged on and seemed interminable. Half of the audience went out, tramping in heavy boots and laughing. The whole thing was a fiasco. The last act was played to almost empty benches. The curtain went down on a titter, a silly laugh, and some groans. As soon as it was over, Dorian Gray rushed behind the scenes into the green room, the actors' common room. The girl was standing there alone, with a look of triumph on her face. Her eyes were lit with an exquisite fire. There was a radiance about her. Her parted lips were smiling over some secret of their own. When he entered, she looked at him, and an expression of infinite joy came over her. "How badly I acted tonight, Dorian," she cried. "Horribly," he answered, gazing at her in amazement. "Horribly, it was dreadful. Are you ill? You have no idea what it was. You have no idea what I suffered." The girl smiled. "Dorian," she answered, lingering over his name with long-drawn music in her voice, as though it was sweeter than honey to the red petals of her mouth. "Dorian, you should have understood. But you understand now, don't you?" "Understand what?" he asked angrily. "Why I was so bad tonight. Why I shall always be bad. Why I shall never act well again." He shrugged his shoulders. "You are ill, I suppose. When you are ill, you shouldn't act. You make yourself ridiculous. My friends were bored. I was bored." She seemed not to listen to him. She was transfigured with joy. An ecstasy of happiness dominated her. "Dorian, Dorian," she cried, "before I knew you, acting was the one reality of my life. It was only in the theatre that I lived. I thought that it was all true. I was Rosalind one night and Portia the other. The joy of Beatrice was my joy, and the sorrows of Cordelia were mine also, characters in Shakespeare. I believed in everything. The common people who acted with me seemed to me to be godlike. The painted scenes were my world. I knew nothing but shadows, and I thought them real. You came, oh my beautiful love, and you freed my soul from prison. You taught me what reality really is. Tonight, for the first time in my life, I saw through the hollowness, the sham, the trickery, the silliness of the empty pageant in which I'd always played. Tonight, for the first time, I became conscious that the Romeo was hideous and old and painted, that the moonlight in the orchard was false, that the scenery was vulgar, and that the words I had to speak were unreal, were not my words, were not what I wanted to say. You had brought me something higher, something of which all art is but a reflection. You had made me understand what love really is. My love, Prince Charming, Prince of Life. I've grown sick of shadows. You are more to me than all art can ever be. What have I to do with the puppets of a play? When I came on tonight, I heard them hissing, and I smiled. What could they know of love such as ours? Take me away, Dorian. Take me away with you where we can be quite alone. I hate the stage. I might mimic or copy a passion that I do not feel, but I cannot mimic one that burns me like fire. You've made me see that. He flung himself down on the sofa and turned away his face. You have killed my love, he muttered. Then he leaped up and went to the door. Yes, he cried, you have killed my love. You used to stir my imagination. Now you don't even stir my curiosity. You simply produce no effect. I loved you because you were marvelous, because you had genius and intellect, because you realized the dreams of great poets and gave shape and substance to the shadows of art. You've thrown it all away. You are shallow and stupid. My God, how mad I was to love you. What a fool I've been. You are nothing to me now. I will never see you again. I will never think of you. I will never mention your name. You don't know what you were to me once. Why once? Oh, I can't bear to think of it. I wish I'd never laid eyes upon you. You have spoilt the romance of my life. I would have made you famous, splendid, magnificent. The world would have worshipped you, and you would have borne my name, carried my name. What are you now? A third-rate actress with a pretty face. You're not serious, Dorian, she murmured. You're acting. Acting! I leave that to you. You do it so well, he answered bitterly. She rose from her knees, and with a piteous expression of pain in her face, came across the room to him. She put her hand upon his arm and looked into his eyes. He thrust her back. Don't touch me, he cried. Dorian, don't leave me, she whispered. I'm so sorry I didn't act well. I was thinking of you all the time, but I'll try, indeed I'll try. It came so suddenly across me, my love for you. I think I should never have known it if you'd not kissed me. If we'd not kissed each other. Kiss me again, my love. Don't go away from me. I couldn't bear it. Oh, don't go away from me. My brother... Oh, no, never mind. He didn't mean it. She's remembering what he said. He was in jest. But you... Oh, can't you forgive me for tonight? I will work so hard and try to improve. Don't be hard on me because I love you better than anything in the world. After all, it's only once that I've not pleased you. But you're quite right, Dorian. I should have shown myself more of an artist. It was foolish of me, and yet I couldn't help it. Oh, don't leave me, don't leave me. A fit of passionate sobbing choked her. She crouched on the floor like a wounded thing, and Dorian Gray with his beautiful eyes looked down at her, and his chiseled lips curled in exquisite disdain, beautiful hatred, exquisite disdain. There's always something ridiculous about the emotions of people whom one has ceased to love, whom one has stopped loving. Sybil Vane seemed to him to be absurdly melodramatic, theatrical. Her tears and sobs annoyed him. "I'm going," he said at last in his calm, clear voice. "I don't wish to be unkind, but I can't see you again. You have disappointed me." In a few moments he was out of the theatre, into this rather creepy-looking world of evil-looking houses, women with hoarse voices and harsh laughter, drunkards reeling by, cursing and chattering to themselves like monstrous apes, grotesque children, ugly in a weird way, children huddled upon doorsteps, and heard shrieks and oaths from gloomy courts. But he goes into his home. As he was turning the handle of the door, his eye fell upon the portrait Basil Hallward had painted of him. He started back as if in surprise. Then he went on into his own room, looking somewhat puzzled. After he'd taken the buttonhole out of his coat, the flower, he seemed to hesitate. Finally he came back, went over to the picture and examined it. In the dim, arrested light that struggled through the cream-coloured silk blinds, the face appeared to him to be a little changed. So it's the first change we see in the painting as a result of him being cruel to Sybil after her play. The expression looked different. One would have said there was a touch of cruelty in the mouth. It was certainly strange. He turned round and, walking to the window, drew up the blind. The bright dawn flooded the room and swept the fantastic shadows into dusky corners where they lay shuddering. But the strange expression that he'd noticed in the face of the portrait seemed to linger there, to be more intensified even. The quivering, ardent sunlight showed him the lines of cruelty around the mouth, as clearly as if he'd been looking into a mirror after he had done some dreadful thing. Cruelty around the mouth. Looks at the painting again. There's no signs of any change when he looked into the actual painting, and yet there was no doubt that the whole expression had altered. It was not a mere fancy of his own. It wasn't just his imagination. The thing was horribly apparent. He threw himself into a chair and began to think. Suddenly there flashed across his mind what he'd said in Basil Hallward's studio the day the picture had been finished, when he made the wish that the painting could age instead of him. Chapter 2. Yes, he remembered it perfectly. He'd uttered a mad wish that he himself might remain young and the portrait grow old, that his own beauty might be untarnished and the face on the canvas bear the burden of his passions and his sins, that the painted image might be seared or burnt with the lines of suffering and thought, and that he might keep all the delicate bloom and loveliness of his then just conscious boyhood. Surely his wish had not been fulfilled. Surely this is not happening, but we know it's happening. Such things were impossible. It seemed monstrous even to think of them. And yet there was the picture before him, with a touch of cruelty in the mouth. Cruelty? Had he been cruel? It was the girl's fault, not his. He had dreamed of her as a great artist, had given his love to her because he had thought her great. Then she had disappointed him. She had been shallow and unworthy. And yet, a feeling of infinite regret came over him. So at least he does feel very sorry for what he did. As he thought of her lying at his feet, sobbing like a little child, he remembered with what callousness he'd watched her, with what an uncaring attitude he'd watched her. So, see, I skipped this, but there's a good line about the soul. Why had he been made like that? Why had such a soul been given to him? Why did he have such a callous or uncaring soul? But he'd suffered also. During the 3 terrible hours that the play had lasted, he'd lived centuries of pain, shame. His life was well worth hers, blah, blah, blah. Why should he trouble about Sybil Vane? She was nothing to him now. But the picture, what was he to say of that? It held the secret of his life and told his story. It had taught him to love his own beauty. Would it teach him to loathe or hate his own soul? Would he ever look at it again? No, it was merely an illusion, a trick of the eyes wrought on the troubled senses. The horrible night that he'd passed had left phantoms behind it. Suddenly there'd fallen upon his brain that tiny scarlet speck that makes men mad. The picture had not changed. It was folly or foolishness to think so. Yet I say again, the picture is changing. Yet it was watching him with its beautiful marred or spoilt face and its cruel smile. Its bright hair gleamed in the early sunlight. Its blue eyes met his own. A sense of infinite pity, not for himself, but for the painted image of himself, came over him. He felt sorry for the painting. It had altered already and would alter more. Its gold would wither into grey. Its red and white roses would die. For every sin that he committed, a stain would fleck and wreck its fairness, but he would not sin. The picture, changed or unchanged, would be to him the visible emblem of conscience. So he makes a very good resolution. He's going to change. Let the painting be his conscience. It'll show him if he's doing something wrong. He'll stop doing it. He would resist temptation, going against what Lord Henry said. The only thing you should not resist is temptation. He would not see Lord Henry anymore. Makes this resolution. Won't be under Henry's evil influence. Would not at any rate listen to those subtle, poisonous theories that in Basil Hallward's garden had first stirred within him the passion for impossible things. He would go back to Sybil Vane, make her amends, make it right with her, marry her, try to love her again. I think this should be in red. It's a biggie. Yes, it was his duty to do so. She must have suffered more than he had. Poor child. He'd been selfish and cruel to her. The fascination that she had exercised over him would return. They would be happy together. His life with her would be beautiful and pure. He got up from his chair and drew a large screen right in front of the portrait, shuddering as he glanced at it. How horrible, he murmured to himself, and he walked across to the window and opened it. When he stepped out onto the grass, he drew a deep breath. The fresh morning air seemed to drive away all his somber passions. He thought only of Sybil. A faint echo of his love came back to him. He repeated her name over and over again. The birds that were singing in the dew-drenched garden seemed to be telling the flowers about her. So Dorian gets a shock here from that painting, reckons that he's going to make it right, won't see Dorian, apologize to her, make it right, marry her, don't be a victim of the subtle poisonous theories anymore. All these wonderful good resolutions Dorian makes here. It's not necessarily going to work out exactly like he's intending. But no spoilers, just come back for more next time, and like and subscribe. Bye-bye.